Magic Tree House, Book Number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning. Chapter 1, Tweet Tweet. Jack sat up in bed. He stared out his window. The sky was dark gray. The sun would be rising soon. It's almost time, he whispered to himself. The day before, in the Magic Tree House, Morgan's note had said, "Come back tomorrow in the early morning." Jack jumped out of bed. He put on his jeans and t-shirt. Then he grabbed his backpack and crept out into the hall. Jack peeked into Annie's room. She wasn't there. He slipped downstairs and out the front door. Annie was sitting on the porch steps. Jack sat down beside her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I was waiting for the birds to start singing," said Annie. "Then I was going to wake you up." Jack and Annie watched the sky go from dark gray to light gray. Then the birds began their song. "Tweet, tweet," said Annie. Without another word, Jack and Annie left their porch. They headed up their street into the Frog Creek woods. It was cool beneath the trees. Jack and Annie hurried through the woods to the rope ladder. It hung from the tallest oak. At the top of the oak was the Magic Tree House. They climbed into the tree house. It was barely light inside. Annie picked up the note lying on the floor. She held it up to the window and read aloud. "Dear Jack and Annie, Camelot is in trouble. To save the kingdom, please find these 4 special kinds of writing for my library. Something to follow, something to send, something to learn, something to lend. Thank you, Morgan." Jack took a deep breath. "Okay," he said. "We have our first special writing, a list from the Civil War." "We have the second," said Annie, "a letter from the Revolutionary War." "We have the third," said Jack, "a poem from a pioneer schoolhouse." "Now we just need one more," said Annie. "I wonder why we have to find these special writings from Morgan's library," said Jack. "How are they going to save Camelot?" "I don't know," said Annie, "but let's get going so we can solve the mystery. Where's our research book?" They looked around the tree house. Their Pennsylvania book, the book that always brought them home, was lying in the corner. Beside it was another book. Annie picked it up. "This is it," she said softly. She showed the book's cover to Jack. It said, "San Francisco, California, 1906. "California?" said Jack. "I've always wanted to go to California." "Me too," said Annie. She laughed. "I guess I told Miss Neely the truth after all." "Yeah," said Jack, smiling. The Magic Tree House had taken them to a pioneer school in their last adventure. There, Annie had told the teacher, Miss Neely, that they were on their way to California. Annie pointed at the cover of the California book. "I really wish we could go there," she said. The wind started to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. Chapter 2, Thunder Under the Ground. "Nice clothes," said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. Annie was wearing a blue and white dress with a big sailor collar and white stockings. Jack was wearing brown knee-length pants, a jacket, a cap, and a tie. His backpack had become a leather bag. He and Annie both wore short lace-up boots. A church bell started to ring. Gong, 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 gong. "It rang 5 times," said Jack. "It must be 5 in the morning." "Yeah," said Annie. She looked out the window. Jack looked with her. The early morning air felt fresh and cool. The tree house had landed in a tree at the bottom of a hill. Painted wooden houses and gas lights lined a quiet cobblestone street. A trolley car moved along tracks up the street. It rounded the top of the hill and disappeared. Tall buildings towered farther off. The sun was behind them, making pink streaks in the blue sky. "It's really pretty here," said Annie. "Yeah," said Jack. He opened the research book and read. On Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, San Francisco was the biggest city on the west coast of the United States. It had a population of 500,000 people. It was also one of the loveliest cities in the country. Jack pulled out his notebook. He wrote, "San Francisco, April 18th, 1906. Biggest city in the West. Lovely." Let's go, Annie said impatiently. Jack looked back at the book. He wanted to learn more. Now, said Annie. She took the book and notebook away from him and put them into his leather bag. Let's not waste any more time. Annie left the tree house. Doing research is not wasting time, Jack called after her. But he slung his bag over his shoulder and followed Annie down the rope ladder. When they had both stepped onto the grass, Jack looked around. Where to? He said. Anywhere, Annie said. Let's explore and see the tourists. Okay, said Jack. But don't forget we have to find the writing from Morgan's library. They started up the cobblestone street. As they walked up the steep hill, the sun rose over the tall buildings. As they walked up the steep hill, the sun rose above the tall buildings. The early light turned everything to gold, stones, street lamps, and the glass windows of the silent houses. It's so quiet and peaceful, said Annie. Yeah, everyone must still be sleeping, said Jack. Suddenly, out of the quiet came a deep rumbling noise. Jack stopped. He grabbed Annie's arm. What's that? He said. The noise got louder. It sounded like thunder coming from under the ground. The earth started shaking. Church bells clanged wildly. The whole street began to move. The cobblestones rolled like waves on the ocean. What's happening? Annie cried. Chimneys fell off roofs. Glass lights toppled over. Bricks crashed to the street. Get down, shouted Jack. Cover your head. Jack and Annie crouched on the ground with their arms over their heads. All around them was rumbling, clanging, crashing, and breaking. Then the world grew still. The rumbling stopped. Jack and Annie raised their heads. The air was filled with dust. It's over, said Jack. That must have been an earthquake, said Annie. I think so, Jack agreed. I guess I should have let you do a little more research on this place, Annie said. Yeah, probably, said Jack. Except I don't know exactly what we could have done. Jack slowly stood up. His legs felt wobbly. As he brushed off his pants, the deep rumbling came again, louder than before. Then the terrible shaking started. It was even harder than before. Jack was hurled to the ground. The earth trembled and quaked. Jack bounced against the hard cobblestones. Annie, he cried. He tried to stand, but fell again. Through the dusty air, he saw the tall buildings swaying against the sky. Roofs were caving in. Up and down the street, bricks, glass, and concrete showered down. It seemed like a long time before the dreadful noise and shaking finally stopped. Chapter 3. The Great Shake. A cloud of dust billowed around Jack. He could hardly breathe. He couldn't see, but he could hear Annie coughing. Jack opened his mouth. Dust filled his throat. Jack! Between coughs, Annie shouted his name. Jack! I'm here, he said hoarsely. I think I'm in trouble, she said. Jack tried to sit up. He hurt all over. His clothes were ripped and covered with dirt. His cap was gone. Where are you? He called. Here, said Annie. Jack started to stand, but he fell down again. His legs were like rubber. But where? He repeated. Jack cleaned his glasses, then looked around. But he still couldn't see Annie through the thick haze of dust. I fell into the ground, said Annie. Jack crawled in the direction of Annie's voice. Keep talking, he said. Here, she coughed. Here! Jack felt a ledge with his hands. He looked down into a huge crack in the street. Through the dust, he could see Annie right below him. You found me, she said between coughs. I'll pull you out, said Jack. He grabbed Annie's hands. He tried to pull her out of the crack, but she was too heavy. I can't do it, he said. Bring me something to stand on, Annie said. Maybe I can get out by myself. Jack stood up and stumbled away from the crack. He gathered an armload of bricks. Then he went back to the crack and handed them down to Annie, one by one. Annie carefully stacked the bricks on top of each other. I need more, she said. Jack ran to get more bricks. He was afraid there'd be another earthquake, and the crack would close, with Annie inside. He handed the bricks down to her. Hurry, he said. I'm hurrying, she said. At last, Annie finished stacking the bricks. She stood on the stack. With her bare hands, She slowly pulled herself up. Jack helped her stand. She was covered with dirt. Her stockings were torn. Her knees were skinned. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked. "A little scraped," said Annie. "How about you?" "A little shaky," said Jack. Actually, he was very shaky. "Me too," said Annie. "I think San Francisco just had a really huge earthquake," Jack said. He coughed. His throat was clogged with dust. Annie coughed too. "What's the book say?" she said. Jack pulled his research book out of his leather bag. His hands were trembling. He could hardly turn the pages. "I'll find it," said Annie. She took the book from him and found a picture of a torn-up sheet. She read aloud. At 5:13 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the people of San Francisco were shaken awake by one of the biggest earthquakes the United States has ever known. Some called it the Great Shake. "No wonder we feel shaky," said Jack. "I wonder if a lot of people got hurt," said Annie. They looked around. Through the dust-filled air, families were stumbling out of their crumbling houses. They all were barefoot, and still wore their night clothes. Some babies and small children were crying, but strangely, the grown-ups were all silent. They just stared at the torn-up sheet and crumbling houses. "Everyone must be in shock," said Annie. "I know how they feel," said Jack. He gazed at the rubble all around them. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't think clearly. Annie looked at the book again. She read aloud. Just after the earthquake, broken chimneys, stoves, and lamps caused terrible fires. The fires raged for 3 days, nearly destroying all of San Francisco. Over 28,000 buildings burned down. "That's terrible," breathed Jack. In the distance, a cloud of black smoke was rolling through the sky. "The fires are starting," said Annie. Chapter 4. What's the story? "Maybe we should leave," Jack said in a panic. He wanted to get out of San Francisco before the fire spread. "We can't," said Annie. "We have to find our special writing from Morgan's library, something to lend." "Let's find it fast," said Jack. He and Annie started walking through the rubble. They stepped over piles of bricks, chunks of concrete, and broken glass. They passed fallen lamps and twisted trolley car tracks. They saw houses leaning to one side and people hauling their things out to the street. "We can't worry about our mission now," Annie said. "We have to help." "Help? How?" said Jack. He was so shaky he didn't think he could be much help to anyone. "What about them?" said Annie. She pointed to some men frantically dragging bags out of a building and piling them into a horse-drawn wagon. Annie ran over to the wagon. "What are you doing?" she asked the men. "We're trying to get these bank bags down to the harbor," said the wagon driver, "so a boat could take them out into the bay." "Why?" asked Jack. "So we can save everyone's money from the fires," the man said. He pointed at the sky. The cloud of smoke was growing bigger and blacker. "Can we help?" asked Annie. "We're done," said the driver. "You kids run home to your parents. Then get out of the city." Jack wished he and Annie could ride with the driver down to the bay and to be safe from the fires too, but he could see the wagon didn't have room for them. "Good luck," said Annie. "Don't forget what I told you," the driver said. Then he and his horses took off. The wagon turned onto the main street and disappeared over the hill. "I wonder who we can help," said Annie. Jack took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe I'll take some notes." Jack pulled out his notebook. In wobbly handwriting he wrote, "Bank money, wagons to bay, then to boat." "Hey, what's the story?" a woman asked. Her voice sounded urgent. Jack looked up. A man and a woman stood in front of them. The woman wore a long dress and carried a notebook. The man wore a suit. He carried a big camera and a 3-legged stand. "What story?" said Annie. "The story with the bank. My name's Betty. I'm a reporter," said the woman. "For television?" asked Annie. "What's that?" said Betty. "Never mind," said Jack. He whispered quickly to Annie. "She's a newspaper reporter. TV hasn't been invented yet." "Oops," said Annie. "So what's the story with the wagon that just left the bank?" Betty asked Jack and Annie. Jack looked down at his notebook. "They're going to save money by taking it to the bay and putting it on a boat," he said. "Good reporting work, Sonny," she said. "Get a picture of the bank, Fred." The photographer set his camera on the stand. He put his head under a black curtain and took a picture. "Got it," said Fred. As the photographer packed up his equipment, Betty turned to Jack and Annie. "Go home and get your parents, kids," she said. "Fires are burning out of control." "We know," said Annie. "By the end of 3 days, the frost will burn down nearly all of San Francisco." Betty looked curious. "How do you know all that?" she asked. "She's just guessing," Jack said quickly. "Pretty gloomy guess," said Betty. "Tell folks not to catch the ferry. Thousands are crowding into the fair building. Go to Golden Gate Park." "Thanks for the tip," said Annie. "Thanks for the story," said Betty. Then she and Fred hurried away. Jack and Annie looked around. Now many people seemed to be fleeing their homes. Some were going up the hill, some were going down. An older woman was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with pots and pans. A girl was carrying a suitcase and a cat. A boy was carrying a bird cage and a fishbowl. "They're all going in different directions," said Annie. "I wonder where Golden Gate Park is," said Jack. "Maybe we should go there. Let's see if there's a map in our book." Jack looked in their research book. He found a map of San Francisco. "Where are we now?" he said. As he looked for a street sign, he saw a man carrying an armload of books out of a beautiful building. The man put the books into the back of a horse-drawn wagon. "What's he doing?" asked Jack. "I bet he's saving those books," said Annie. "Saving books?" said Jack. He loved books. For a moment, Jack forgot his fear. He forgot about trying to save himself. "We better help," he said. "Come on." Chapter 5. Stop! Stop! Jack and Annie ran up the street to the book wagon. The man was carefully stacking the books in the back of the wagon. He was covered with dust, and his glasses were cracked. "Hey, what's the story?" Annie asked the man. Jack couldn't help smiling. Annie sounded just like the newspaper reporter. "I'm moving all the rare books to the pavilion," the man said. "Can we help?" asked Jack. "Sure, there are only a few left by the door," said the man. "Grab 'em, hurry. The first on Market Street will soon be blowing this way." Jack and Annie ran into the building. Near the door were 2 small stacks of books. Jack and Annie each gathered up a stack. The books looked very old and fancy. Some even had sparkling gold on their covers. "Wow," whispered Jack. He and Annie carried the books outside. "Careful, please," said the man. "All these books are treasures, ancient Bibles and hand-painted books." The man carefully took the books from Jack's and Annie's arms and put them in the back of the wagon. "Thanks," he said, pushing his hat back. "Run home now. The first will be here soon." As the horses started up the hill, Annie waved and shouted, "Good luck!" "I bet he was the librarian," said Jack. He opened his research book. He looked for a photograph of the building that had the books. "Here it is," he said. He read aloud. "People try to save special things, but they do not always succeed. Rare books from a library were moved to the pavilion building. When the pavilion building caught fire, all the books burned. The building that originally held them did not burn at all." "Oh, no!" cried Jack. "Stop! Stop!" Clutching the research book, he ran after the wagon. Annie ran with him. "Stop! Stop!" they both yelled. They ran as fast as they could over the broken cobblestones and up the steep hill. Near the top, the driver finally heard them. He brought his wagon to a halt. "You can't go to the pavilion," Jack cried. "You have to take them back to the building where they were," said Annie. "They won't burn there," said Jack, trying to catch his breath. "The building we're taking them to is going to burn instead." The driver looked at Jack and Annie as if they were crazy. "You kids need to worry about yourselves, not these books," he said. "Go home to your parents. I'll take care of the library." Then the man snapped his reins and went on over the hilltop. "Come back!" Jack cried. They watched helplessly as the wagon bumped down the street over the rubble. Smoke billowed up from the bottom of the hill. "I can't believe it," Jack said. He was close to tears. "We tried, but we couldn't save them," said Annie. She touched Jack's shoulder gently. "All those books." His voice trailed off. "Hey," said Annie. "Someone's crying over there. Someone with 2 kids. Maybe we can help them."